record on this computer. Share screen. Okay. Can everyone see the screen? Let's see if I can get the chat up as well. Right. So today we're going to do. So yesterday, sort of did a bit of an introduction or review introduction on emulation, but as a way of letting you know about GPy. And today, what we're going to do is go through another piece of software called EmuKit. That is the main software that we're going to use for surrogate modeling. I mean, you can do it directly with GPy, but what you're going to see is this framework that you can use for building around whatever sort of physical model you like. And a number of the things we're going to talk about are already implemented in there, and it's quite modular. So this is what it's called. It's called EmuKit. It has this interesting history. So when the group was in Sheffield, I guess this is about 8 years ago, Javier Gonzalez came to work as a postdoc, and we were looking at optimizing the design of genes, well, proteins expressed by genes, through changing the sort of GC content and various other characteristics of the gene. So in order to do that, I said, well, we already had GPy, the software you've seen. I said, oh, we should do some Bayesian optimization. And Javier built this software called GPyOpt that you've seen already in the Bayesian optimization lecture. Now, a few years after that, Javier, myself, and a couple of others joined Amazon. And in effect, the thing that we brought into Amazon was this software GPyOpt, which is now deployed to various parts inside Amazon. But this sort of slightly funny thing happened is this software was deployed. And in some sense, that kind of meant we lost sort of ownership of the code base internally. And I guess that made us think, well, what do we want to do? I mean, the external code base was still fine, but there was an internal fork of the code base, which we sort of effectively, because it was a production system. So that caused us to sort of think about what we really want to do if we were to build GPyOpt from scratch. And this is basically the result. It's called EmuKit. And the lead software engineer, as I've mentioned before, is a guy called Andre Pellais. And he actually was also the person that integrated GPyOpt's code into Amazon systems. So he knew a lot from that. And Javier did the scientific lead. Then we had lots of people joining in, who I'll list in a moment. But this is the sort of software online. In fact, this is an old picture of the software. And if you look very carefully, you can see in the top left, it says amzn.github.io, because it was hosted in the Amazon GitHub repo. Because one of the things we noticed is a really great way of sharing software around the company was actually to make it open source software. So we made it MIT licensed open source software. And that really allowed us to, with this software, not lose control over it in the way we lost control of the previous software, because it was an open source software. And it also gave us a lot of applications within the company that weren't even things we were directly working on. Javier just helped out various teams in deploying this software in those various applications. So there's things that I haven't talked about at all because I'm not aware of the details of, but where this software ended up being used. So that turned out to be a really nice strategy. And the other nice part of that strategy is that we're effectively indirectly maintaining this software still. So Andre moved the repo to, with Amazon's approval, to emukit.github.io. They're continuing to use it, several people inside, and we're continuing to maintain it. And if you do go to this website, which is linked from the notes, you'll find the sort of various tutorials. And a lot of the material I'll talk about is based on those tutorials. So as I was sort of saying, it's a software project that was led by Javier Gonzalez and Andre Pellais, who's now a PhD student in the department, but lots of input from other people who were either working the team. So Mark and Maren were scientists in the team. Alex, Aaron, Henry, and David Elias were all interns. And Cliff McCullum was the software development manager for the team. And then I guess I was the sort of director. So I kind of keep thinking I did almost effectively nothing but be supportive and show vision and that sort of thing. So it's available on GitHub, and there's various examples that in effect we're going to go through now. And there's also quite nice documentation, as I think you'll see when you start using it. We were quite careful about a lot of that stuff. So the key thing about EmuKit is it has this very modular design. And just to give you a sort of example of that, although we obviously had this software we built called GPy, which was a surrogate modeling software, you don't have to use that surrogate modeling software. You can use any surrogate modeling software you like. So within EmuKit, there's what we call model wrappers. And these model wrappers are there for you to wrap the surrogate model that you want to use. And then within EmuKit, it'll just plug that together with whatever acquisition function. So remember, the acquisition function was a component that Carl-Henrik was talking about for acquiring new data. And there's examples of how to do that. So one of the exercises or probably the only exercise in this week's lab book is to go through implementing your own surrogate model. And the notebook there suggests doing that so scikit-learn has its own implementation of Gaussian processes. And so you could try using that instead of GPy as a surrogate model. Of course, nowadays there's also examples of using TensorFlow. We can also make use of things like Pyro, you know, and that's the sort of thing that you might be interested in doing for projects. Okay, so what's the vision? Well, I actually quite clearly remember the sort of meetings. I was obviously participating in the design meetings, and we were sort of saying, well, what's going to be different about EmuKit versus GPyOpt? And the target basically was to have a much more general modular structure. So here's all the modules that I'm going to go through individually in some point that are part of the software. And the idea being is you can pick and mix these different modules in order to undertake different methods, or even what we sort of view as a task. So the sort of main abstract structure is a model loop, which does all the management around everything of calling the emulator, potentially calling the simulator that's in there. The candidate point calculator, which makes use of the acquisition function and the acquisition optimizer in order to describe which set of points you need to look at next. So that's obviously being called by the loop. And it's also making use of the surrogate model. The user function, or target function. So this would be the simulation that you're trying to simulate. The model updater is for updating your surrogate model once you've acquired your point. And then a stopping condition, when to bring the whole loop to a close. And in the lab or the worksheet you've got today, you'll see that you get to go through that process. That process, in this case, being for what's perhaps the simplest task you can do with an emulator. So simpler, I would say, than Bayesian optimization, but just experimental design. So experimental design, by that we mean where should we acquire our data points. Okay. So here's the EmuKit vision. The idea is we've got different methods. So things like Bayesian optimization and experimental design that we want to use. And we're going to have different models, probabilistic models that can be used to emulate the system. So EmuKit doesn't define these. I mean, well, there's one, and you'll see that in the tutorial, called simple Gaussian process regression, which is just there for demo purposes. But basically the idea is we don't have to rely on someone's particular implementation from Gaussian process. Of course, GPy is by far the best implementation, and all other implementations are rubbish. But if you do want to choose GPFlow or GPyTorch or sklearn's implementation of Gaussian processes, you know, they do have interesting advantages. Of course, I was joking about the GPy thing. It's just the original implementation, not necessarily the best. And you can use those packages alongside with EmuKit. EmuKit is sort of indifferent to how you use them. Of course, some model wrappers have already been written, so that means GPy is very convenient, for example. And then tasks. Now, this is something that we haven't put a lot of effort into yet, but it's something that was always envisaged for the package. So the idea is that you're not just doing emulation for the sake of getting academic papers or answering questions on an academic course or whatever, that in the end, we actually really care about things about the simulator. So the simulator itself, we might be trying to check its quality. So a really important thing that you might be trying to do is measure the quality of a simulator and compare it to what's going on in the real world. That's exactly the sort of thing that a company might be interested in doing all the time. Now, in order to do that, you might be using various methods and various different emulators. So we sort of have this concept of a task that sits all above everything I've talked about so far, but it's not seriously implemented a lot there. We're hoping to observe patterns of behavior that people use EmuKit for before defining some of those things. We don't want to put the cart before the horse, as it were. Okay, so, but very simply, the structure of what's going on is as follows. So you've got a stopping criterion, and while you're stopping criterion, and that your stopping criterion might be as simple as do this for a loop of 10 times. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, until you've got the optima to some precision or the function to some precision. It might just be run this 10 times, you know, that's user set. So until that stopping criterion is met, you go through this loop of, well, you have this model, you use that to find the next point, which is through optimization of the acquisition function. You then evaluate the user function at that next point, and then you update your surrogate model with the observations. And then you just loop through that. And that's what we saw, in effect, Carl-Henrik showing us for Bayesian optimization, where the acquisition function was, in that case.
Can you lift your mic?
Yeah, sorry, is it rubbing again? Yeah, sorry, I shouldn't wear this because I'm trying to save on the heating. I know we've got environmental science people. Okay, sorry about that. So the user function we've got is, you know, in the example that Carl-Henrik showed was the Forster function. We're going to use that again today. But the acquisition function was expected improvement that he was using for Bayesian optimization there. And then, so through the loop is, once you acquire the point, you update the model and then go around the loop again, get the acquisition function again. So the way, as we're saying, that's implemented in EmuKit is with an abstract class called loop, the sort of main loop where all the different components come together. And that loop is calling, you know, management, the calling of the different parts of where the points should be by calling in return the sort of emulator, the acquisition function, optimizing the acquisition function. All those sort of bits that are going on, but you don't really want to worry about them if you're trying to do perhaps a Bayesian optimization. Of course, the model, that's what we've mainly talked about. So the surrogate model, or the emulator as we call it, and that's often a Gaussian process. It doesn't have to be. Indeed, every time you load Amazon's website with a new product on it, you run an emulator that was built by Javier's team inside Amazon. That's a neural network, because it turned out in that case, we didn't need to do the uncertainty emulation. So every time you're learning Amazon's web page, I don't want to say where that emulator is, because, you know, I'm not sure that secret source and all this sort of stuff about what's going on. But every time you're loading an Amazon web page, you're running one of our emulators as I speak. People are doing that all the time. But that one happens to be a neural network. It's not a Gaussian process. We had enough data there that we didn't have to worry about the uncertainty. The candidate point calculator. So this is got to combine the acquisition with the optimizer of the acquisition to compute, to computer. That's a sort of common slip. I write computer more than I write compute. Compute the next candidate data point, or indeed points. You don't necessarily have to do Bayesian optimization one point at a time. Javier himself has written a paper on batch Bayesian optimization, where at after each observation, you select several candidate points. That can often be an important thing if you're, say, working with a biologist and you're trying to do Bayesian optimization in that domain. often biologists carry out experiments in batches, because they create, if they're working with cells, they create a batch of cells. There may be like 64 in a batch, and they can run different experiments on those cells at the same time. So they want to know what 64 experiments should they do, not what single experiment they should do. The acquisition function in Bayesian optimization, we saw that. We were using expected improvement. There's other acquisition functions that also Carl-Henrik spoke about, and we're going to see a couple more today that we would be using for experimental design. And something we haven't talked about in great detail, but is sort of going on in the background. Once you've got that acquisition function, the way you select the next point is you optimize that acquisition function with respect to the inputs. And this is done with standard nonlinear optimization. So this could be done, for example, with limited memory BFGS, which is a sort of a quasi-Newton method. So it's a sort of second order method. But again, you can define the optimizer you prefer. There may be reasons you don't want to use that. This is a very good standard nonlinear optimizer that I think people are using for Gaussian processes a lot in as well. But there may be reasons you don't want to use this, and then you can define a different optimization function to sort of combine with the acquisition to get that value out. The user function, it's funny, this is kind of it's the elephant in the room. It's the thing that is so important that I spent all that time talking in the simulation lecture about, but in the end, in the demos we're doing, we're often just showing you things like the sine function or the Forster function. But of course, this is the thing that the scientist brings to the setup. I did look actually to try and find some interesting examples with computational fluid dynamics and stuff to run. The real problem is that a lot of them don't run in native Python. They have sort of Fortran compilations behind them or C++. And so it's quite hard to find ones that run in the Google Colab. But if anyone does find a really cool simulation piece of software that runs sort of in native Python, installs in Google Colab, let me know, and I'll try and introduce some more examples around such simulations. And certainly we'll want to use more complex simulations, I think, in the project. So we'll hear about some of them when we have the guest lectures. So the model updater is this process of, well, I've got new training data now because my acquisition function told me that we should look in this new part of the space. And now I need to update the surrogate model. So depending on which surrogate model I'm using, depending on whether I'm using a Gaussian process or if I could even potentially be using a random forest model, those models will have different approaches to updating. And that's not EmuKit's business. EmuKit just says, look, here's the new point, here's the old model, please update and send me a new updated model. And presume someone else has worked out how to do that. But the model updater routine is another thing that needs there. And then finally, how to stop the cycle. So as I said, the simplest idea is just do 10 iterations or something like that. And that's what we're going to sort of see in the notebook. That we just choose to do 10. Okay. So to go back to what kind of EmuKit can provide, and we're not going to go through all of it. So for example, one thing we're definitely not going to cover in this course is Bayesian quadrature. So Bayesian quadrature is when you compute the integrals of a function. So that's a really interesting thing to be able to do. So imagine you have some simulator and you want to integrate that simulator along one of its input directions. So if you wanted to do that, then to do it well, one of the things you can do is fit a surrogate model and integrate the surrogate model. And this is an approach that I think was first proposed by Tony O'Hagan, who was my colleague in Sheffield. So when I first went to Sheffield in 2001, Tony was professor of statistics there. He's emeritus professor there now. And he has been one of the sort of leading people behind this type of surrogate modeling. They had a big project in Sheffield focusing on that. But We won't be talking too much about Bayesian quadrature, but it's there. In fact, that's the work sort of Alex Gessner did in EmuKit, that you can have acquisition functions that are associated with trying to get the best understanding of an integral of the target function. We're going to talk about sensitivity analysis next week. You've heard a little bit about Bayesian optimization already, so we've covered that. And next week, for the second lecture, I'm going to plan to try and get on to multi-fidelity emulation. Perhaps not the most complex forms of multi-fidelity emulation, but I kind of think that's also where things start getting interesting. So next Friday, I think we'll cover multi-fidelity emulation. And next Thursday, we're going to look at sensitivity analysis. So trying to understand the influence of the inputs of the function on the outputs. So solvable indices. That's for Thursday. But so for the rest of today's session, we're going to look at experimental design. So experimental design, in machine learning, sometimes people will call this active learning. But we're sort of using the statistical terminology here, which is this whole field known as design of experiments. Why do they think of it as design of experiments? Well, I guess it relates to certainly historically the notion of statistical design and deciding what data points you need to collect in order to answer a specific question. In machine learning, a closely related topic is known as active learning. So active learning is where you have a learning algorithm that can decide to acquire new data. And so it decides to look for that data in certain places. And if you look at the experimental design literature in statistics or the active learning literature in machine learning, you'll see a lot of highly related ideas that often don't cite each other across the sort of divide, which is, of course, slightly frustrating. I think the really nice thing about going into the physical world is when you start doing these things in the real world, these barriers between fields start to matter less because you're just trying to solve the problem. And one of the things I struggle with machine learning at the moment is there's far too little solving problems and far too much solving benchmark data sets. And that's where you get into this world where people don't talk across boundaries. Once you start focusing on complex real world problems and you bring experts together, they can very quickly understand their different languages, their different understandings through looking at the domain or through understanding the data they have. And that's one of the reasons I really like it when you're actually looking at the real world problems, and really admire people who do that type of work. So as a sort of little aside on that, one person's website that I really suggest you go and have a look at, because it's another sort of use of these surrogate models that we haven't spoken about yet, is Alex Forster's. So Alex is a sort of design engineer. I guess you'd say he's a computational design engineer, but his PhD thesis was all about design using surrogate models to assist in the design. So what am I showing you here? Well, he's got an aerodynamics background, so I think his thesis focused on things like design of aerofoils, the sort of thing one might do for Ferrari. But what I'm showing you there is now a load of suggestions for Gaza wanted his 40 quid back. But what I was showing you there was a sort of simulation from work that Alex does on sports design. So the sort of thing that he looks at now is actually, he's got some really cool projects. He's a keen cyclist, as you know, that's something that Carl-Henrik and I are partial to. But one of his projects is around human-powered flight. So he has this ongoing project to design, and if you go to his website at Southampton, you'll see that he's been designing a plane which has a bicycle in it. And I think that seems to be bringing together a bunch of his interests, because he also works a lot on sports design and trying to optimize, say, swimming strokes. So what we saw there was a model, simulation he has of a breaststroke kick. and he's worked with international swimmers. So you can combine this model of the breaststroke kick with an assessment of how fast that's likely to make these swimmers with the actual swimmers themselves. On his site, he's got these pictures of these suits that he gets these swimmers to wear. So you can do Bayesian optimization across the human's capability in the breaststroke kick. Why have I sort of gone off on a little tangent about Alex? Well, I had the pleasure of meeting him in France when we were doing a review of the Mascot Num project, which is another major sort of surrogate modeling group. I think I've put links in the notes to these groups. And we were co-examining a PhD thesis together. And well, one of the reasons Alex's name is known is because this function that we've already used for Bayesian optimization, the Forster function, was a function I think he maybe initially used in his PhD thesis, but certainly it's used in a book that he co-authored with his PhD supervisor, Andy Keene, and others. And it has this sort of rather nice form that Carl-Henrik was using already to show Bayesian optimization, because it's got these sort of interesting shapes where you might get stuck when you're doing 1D optimization, but there's this one global minima within the domain of 0 to 1. So that's the Forster function. And it's, if you're interested in the sort of things people are doing with surrogate modeling, Alex Forrester's website is a really cool place to go and look. So what I want to look at is experimental design in EmuKit, and that's going to be what you do in the sort of lab sheet, the worksheet. So we're going to look at the Forster function, and instead of trying to find the minima of this function, in experimental design, we're just trying to find the most information about this function as possible. So we don't want to necessarily, we don't want the integral, we don't want the minima, we're just interested in information about the function. Now, in this case, as normally, we've got an initial design. So this setting up with an initial design where we apparently already know the values of this function at these following 3 observations. So that's 0.2, 0.6, and 0.9. And in experimental design, the very natural thing to look at, apologies for the model sort of sitting over the error bars there. The very natural thing to look at is the uncertainty in the function. So what you're seeing here is the fit of an emulator to those 3 initial design points. You can see it's a sort of, the orange line here is the mean function. And then this is 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, which is like 95% error bars, and 3 standard deviations, 99% error bars. So you might sort of think, well, where do we want to get a data point next, given this is our surrogate fit? And there's, of course, people have looked at that, and they've looked at it in terms of acquisition functions. So the first acquisition function is the following, and this notation here is just saying the posterior variance of the function. So if we go back, the posterior variance is just the square of this standard deviation here. So all that function is saying is that I just want to acquire where I'm most uncertain about the function. So if I acquire there, in effect, I'm going to reduce my uncertainty to 0 at that point, because when we do these, well, typically, we don't use the stochastic term in the Gaussian process. So just as you see with these observations here, the uncertainty is 0. So the first sort of obvious acquisition function is just called uncertainty function, uncertainty sampling, which is just to say that I want to acquire where the variance is highest. Now that's acquisition function 1. Another one, and a sort of perhaps more interesting one, is called integrated variance reduction. So in integrated variance reduction, what you do is you say, well, you take the domain that you're interested in, X, and here we've got the variance of the function across that domain. So we're going to integrate over X prime. Oh, 2 people entered the waiting room. What are they doing entering the waiting room now? admit all. Sorry. So what you've got here is this sigma squared x prime term is the variance, and you can see this function is doing is integrating across that variance. But what this function here represents is the updated variance given my new observation, right? So it's saying if I make a new observation, that's going to change the variance. So this is like after the model update, I'm acquiring this new point x, and this is going to be my new variance after that update. And I'm going to integrate over that. So my variance reduction is the sort of total variance I'm seeing at the moment minus what the new variance will be. So I'm sort of integrating across the variance across all points. Now that integral is typically going to be intractable. It's not always going to be intractable, but it's going to be intractable for general covariance functions. So rather than doing that integral exactly, what you can do instead is do a sample-based approximation to the integrated variance reduction. And that sample-based approximation will be relatively cheap if you are using a sort of fast surrogate model. And in fact, you can rewrite it in this form. So let's have a look at what that looks like. I think it's quite interesting, this, because you're seeing the two acquisition functions together. So there's this unusual, I mean, these little dips here in the green they look like they have width. Really, they don't have width, right? They're sort of delta functions. If you observe the same point again, you get no information about the rest of the function, right? So basically, the variance reduction, if you observe exactly the same point again, is 0. But even if you move a little bit away from that point, then you start to gain some sort of information about the rest of the function, because you're learning, in effect, something about the gradient. If you sort of move even slightly away from that original point, you can imagine that in effect you're learning something about what the gradient of the function must look like here, which is actually quite a lot of information. So it's sort of initially surprising, perhaps, that for the integrated variance reduction, that you do gain something by having an observation very close. With the uncertainty sampling, you kind of really don't, because the uncertainty sampling is only really worrying about the information you gain at that point. But because in effect, if you move slightly away, you're learning something about the gradient, you do gain some information at other points. So there's an interesting sort of difference between the two. Also, notice this behavior on the left, that the integrated variance reduction is suggesting that going out to the left gives you less information than the uncertainty sampling, where if you, with the uncertainty sampling, go out to the left, you basically get the same acquisition function score as if you come, so at 0 and at 0.4, it's roughly the same. Whereas the integrated variance reduction much prefers the 0.4 point, the acquisition at 0.4. So why is that? Well, because if you do acquire at 0.4 and you're looking at the integrated variance reduction, you're gaining information about the function on both sides. So there's more information to gain. If you acquire on the edge, so we've said that the domain for this function is 0 to 1. If you acquire on the edge, you're only gaining information to the right of. So there's a sort of boundary condition effect. So the uncertainty sampler is equally happy with going to 0 or 0.4, whereas the integrated variance reduction prefers to be more in the center of the domain, because that's giving you more information about the domain overall. Kind of makes sense. Okay. So actually, if you rerun this in this example, so this is the acquisition function that's being given to EmuKit. So EmuKit does this bit, all this bit for you. You tell what the acquisition function you want, and then it does the optimization. Now, I've run this several times as I've been checking the code and making sure it works. And occasionally it decides to acquire a point here, right? So it happens to be acquiring at 0.4 in this case, but very often it tries to acquire at 1, because the acquisition is multimodal. So you can sort of see, again, if you were doing batch optimization, there's interesting things about what you might want to try and do with this multimodality. And that was a paper that Javier worked on, was sort of how you might try and deal with that, because you might be tempted to acquire each of these points if you were going to require 3 points instead of 1. Anyway, so it happens in this case. If you rerun it, though, it seems to sometimes choose this other case. It happens to choose to acquire at 0.4. So in the lab, you'll see basically it's written out a bit of code just to illustrate what happens. So the sort of steps in the lab class, as well as providing you the loop, we've broken down the loop, and this is effectively what happens when you're doing the model update, right? So you've got that new that x new is now 0.4. That's coming from the optimizing the acquisition function. And here we're calling the target function, which is the Forster function. But in general, that might be a simulation or a climate model or something else. And we're getting the new observation out. And then in this case, this little bit of code is just appending that new observation to the model, the surrogate model. And then that surrogate model is stored as the EmuKit model, and we're just resetting the data for that. So that's handling the model updating in this case. So we're going from, just to remind you, this is the original model of this form. So it was suggesting to acquire at 0 or 0.4. And it's suggested to tell us, well, according to the acquisition function, it was 0 or 0.4. And we happen to land on 0.4. And now this is the updated model. So the updated model, it's the wrong updated model. Sorry, something's gone wrong here, because it's actually the wrong updated model, because the acquired point is this one, right? And remember I said, I did say that, like, oh, sometimes it goes the other way around. And I think my figures have got out of sync in different times I've run it. So you're seeing a figure where it actually chose to update here. No, that's slightly annoying. Let me just, I was like happily seeing, oh, the code's running, so everything's okay. But in reality, it wasn't, because I ran it out of sync. So I'm just going to try and pull up the notebook in Colab so that we can get a proper look at these and run it to that point. So of course you can do this yourselves just by clicking on the let me just find the right point, and then I'm going to share a notebook with you. Right, it's going to take a little bit of time to run everything, I think, because the notebooks, as you noticed, they have to do an install first. Let's just check what's running. Yeah, so it's having to install the dependencies. But once it's finished the install, it should pop up down here. So this is the acquisition function that we were just looking at. And then this was the combination of target function into the model that we're running. This is the sort of, I was reflecting that I should just write a helper function to do these plots. And there's the updated plot that we're just seeing. Now and then here we're explicitly calling the acquisition function to optimize. So once we've got that new update, so it's now picked this. So ignore that one. It's picked this point, right? So now after that acquisition, it's choosing to pick the next point. Those helps that have just come up. Let's see, is that now updated in a reasonable way? Yeah, so now we're seeing, so as I said, like here, the acquisition, this is the first point acquisition, and it's chosen over here on the left. And then that's the old figure, sorry, that hasn't updated. And now with that model fit, it's added that data point and we've got the new function. Now we're running the acquisition again, doing the optimization of the acquisition on the updated model, and now it's picking the 0.4 point. So yeah, both of these are good points to pick, and it happens to first pick that and the second pick that. And now this is the situation. So now we have points equispaced at 0.0, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6. Now, as we sort of say, we don't really want to sort of iterate or write out all that code multiple times. So the last thing you'll see in the lab is just telling EmuKit to run it with its experimental design loop. So you remember I said at the beginning that EmuKit has an experimental design loop. Let me just pop back to the slides. So the relevant bit of code here is import experimental design loop, which is that loop that manages everything for us. So rather than doing all those stages ourselves, we just have to define the model, which is defined above in the code. So there's the model, and that's being passed in. We have to define the space. So what's the parameter space that we're optimizing over? So you'll see that there's a sort of object class for defining the space, a continuous parameter space. And then we're creating an experimental design loop, which here is being called ED. And then we're doing run loop on this target function. So all these things don't need the target function, but the loop needs the target function. And then we're going to do that 10 times. And once we've done that, so we get those points we had before, plus a series of points across the function. And here we are actually plotting the posterior standard deviations, but it's done a good job of flattening out the uncertainty across the entire function. So we're basically in a situation where it's sort of learned the function after 10 points. Okay, so sorry about that little glitch on the order of updates of the acquisition functions, but I'll get that fixed in the notes as soon as I finish the lecture here. And just to sort of give some conclusions. So what we've been doing today is introducing this software, EmuKit, that is taking all the hassle out of building these things away from you, but still requires you to define things like your surrogate model and allows you to bring in your knowledge to that surrogate model. So by building certain covariance functions or whatever else. So you can still obviously do all that design that we were talking about last time around the Gaussian process in order to capture what you think is the most interesting aspects of the system that you're simulating. But you just plug it into the EmuKit software that handles the running around of the loop, has got the acquisition functions implemented. Of course, it also allows you to implement your own acquisition functions. So just as you can implement your own model wrappers, you can implement your own acquisition functions. We've taken you through an example of that with experimental design, which is a sort of relatively simple surrogate modeling approach. So, and as I said, when you look at EmuKit, what it's trying to do is it's saying, well, yeah, Bayesian optimization is great. And, we did write a package on that, and it's still quite a widely used package. But you realize that everything that we've sort of just said in terms of surrogate modeling when describing EmuKit is it can be instantiated in a particular way that gives you Bayesian optimization. But what we're interested in here is really building out different methods, so quadrature, sensitivity analysis, experimental design, and even combining those different sets of methods to create what we call tasks, this idea where we might want to be checking the quality of a simulator, and we may want to use a number of these different methods when we're trying to understand the quality of a simulator. I think that's all I wanted to talk about today, so I'll stop there